The Falcons are lining up their defensive coordinator candidates. We'll talk about what a Brian Flores-led Falcons defense might look like, or will they be borrowing a page from the New Orleans Saints? And is history repeating itself with the Broncos blocking an interview with one of the top candidates?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Sirius Black, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, and a.k.a. the most humble host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day. And today's episode is presented by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. Just pick 2 to 5 players, and they score more or less than their Prize Picks projection. You can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com, promo code Locked On. Guys, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, it's free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube, and you'll get the video version of the podcast the night before the audio drops. And make sure you check out Locked On Falcons on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV by downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app on your Roku and Amazon Fire TV. So if you guys are making us your first watch, I guess you could say, on YouTube, you probably will notice that I'm wearing a hat and a hoodie, and that is because I'm trying to save a little bit of money for this upcoming trip to the Senior Bowl. And so you will probably see me in some combination of a hat and a hoodie because my heating bill was a little high last month, and I'm trying to lower it, and I need to be warm while I record these episodes. So if you see me in similar clothes, every day this week, it is not because my hygiene is bad. It's just I'm trying to keep warm. I am changing and I'm showering every day. So don't worry about that. If that was your biggest concern, watching the podcast or index, just want to give you that heads up front. But today we're going to be talking less about my hygiene and more about the Falcons defensive coordinator search. And we'll get into a couple of candidates now that it seems like the Falcons are kind of lining up some interviews, putting out their requests for various interviews. And, before we get into some of the specific guys and what they could potentially bring, there should be a general disclaimer, right? Just because the Falcons have requested an interview does not necessarily guarantee that they will interview that person. And just because they interview a person does not guarantee that that guy is going to be hired for the job. I think, step 0 would be requesting the interview. Step 1 would be the actual interview. And I think oftentimes fans will always skip to step 5, which is, we have a top 10 defense. And it's like, there's a couple of steps in between there. So, I think what these interview requests say is it seems like the Falcons are at least open to the idea of changing how they play defensively, because a couple of these candidates, presumably bring a very different style of defense than what the Falcons have played the last 2 seasons under Dean Pease, the now retired Dean Pease, and under Arthur Smith. And I think Brian Flores is the name that most embodies that. Josina Anderson on Sunday reported the Falcons have requested an interview for Flores. And I think that's music to the ears of a lot of Falcon fans, because it seems like, at least based off of Twitter and my comments here on YouTube, he seems to be among the most popular options to I think a lot of fans. And he's currently a senior defensive assistant. I think he's also coaching the linebackers for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Obviously, Brian Flores is well known for his short stint with the Miami Dolphins as their head coach, inheriting a bad Dolphins defense in his first year in 2019. The 2018 Dolphins defense was 26 in DVOA, according to Football Outsiders. His first year there, Flores, that is, they were 32nd. So they were the worst defense in the league that year. That was their sort of tank for Tua year. But then they made a big jump the next year in 2020, going to 11th in DVOA, then 10th in 2021, although that they were probably closer to league average, and then they got a big boost from a late season game going up against Ian Book. But, the thing about the Flores' defenses were they were very aggressive, number 2 in blitz rate, I believe, in 2020 and 2021. They were among the top teams in terms of usage of man coverage in both of those years. They're also a defense that used a lot of dime looks, in part to try to get those DBs, 6 DBs on the field in order to match up. And sort of the hallmark of what Flores was able to do was taking a bad defense, rebuild it in his own image through the draft with picks like Christian Wilkins and Javon Holland and Raekwon Davis and Jalen Phillips. And then probably more importantly, getting a big boost and investing significant resources in free agency, bringing in guys like Byron Jones and Kyle Van Noy and Emmanuel Ogbah and Justin Coleman. And I think that's kind of the exact formula that a lot of Falcon fans, including myself, kind of want to see this team do this offseason in order to sort of turn things around. Now, I think if you're playing, that's kind of the pros of a Brian Flores-led defense. The cons of it is, you know, his style of defense, that man-heavy, aggressive look, is going back to comments that we've made before about, you know, defensive philosophy. It's kind of a live by the sword, die by the sword philosophy, and nothing embodies that more than the Falcons beating the Dolphins in 2021, where they played a lot of that man coverage and Kyle Pitts absolutely annihilated them. And so that's kind of the give and take with that. Obviously, the other issue, I wouldn't call it a con, but the other issue surrounding Brian Flores is the giant elephant in the room, which is his ongoing lawsuit against the NFL for alleged discriminatory hiring practices among coaches, and guys like Steve Wilkes and Ray Horton are a part of that suit as well. So that is something that is unsettled. How that impacts his ability to get, you know, jobs or leave Pittsburgh or whatever, have no idea. But that's certainly something that if he were to take over the Falcons, you know, coaching defensive coordinator spot, like that sort of shifts now to the Falcons, you know, purview or whatever, under their umbrella, so to speak. So, you know, I think the main thing with Brian Flores is he's kind of the polar opposite of Dean Pease, with that aggressive style of defense versus, you know, Dean Pease has been but don't break style of defense. So if, you know, your biggest issue with Dean Pease was philosophical, and you wanted to see a much more aggressive style of defense, I think Brian Flores is exactly sort of up your wheelhouse. Now, if I could take a moment to editorialize for a second, when it comes to Brian Flores, no issue with Brian Flores being the Falcons candidate. You know, I understand exactly why the Falcons are interested in Brian Flores. I would be a little skeptical if Brian Flores has the same level of interest with the Falcons. So we'll see if I'm wrong on that. You know, I feel like he's kind of been there, done that when it comes to rebuilding a defense. He successfully did it in Miami, and he's going to be tasked with doing that in Atlanta. And I don't know if that's as enticing or alluring as it may have been for a guy that isn't already an established, you know, top defensive mind. And, you know, if his goal is to become another head coach again, you know, is coming to Atlanta and successfully rebuilding a defense really going to help him in that arena? Or, you know, maybe as they say, learning from one of the top head coaches, you know, potentially a Hall of Famer, Mike Tomlin, playing, you know, continuing to maintain a stable environment in Pittsburgh seems, to me, at least from my perspective, if I was in Brian Flores' shoes, if I was Brian Flores' advisor, you know, I would think that's probably a better opportunity for him to advance his potential head coaching potential in Pittsburgh versus Atlanta. But, you know, obviously, you know, I'm a hater and I'm biased. That's why they call me Mr. Drew. And but, you know, we'll see. We'll see what happens with that. So, you know, we'll leave Brian Flores aside, talk about another sort of up and coming candidate in Saints defensive line coach and co-defensive coordinator Ryan Nielsen, and what he would bring to the table as the Falcons defensive coordinator. And we'll get into that, guys, as we continue today's episode. But I want to tell you about Prize Picks, a fun new way to play daily fantasy. All you got to do is pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. It takes less than a minute to enter. And of course, this time of year is a great time to play on Prize Picks because of NFL playoffs. But it's not just the NFL. You got projections on the NBA, MLB, NHL, PGA, college sports, esports, so much more. And the great thing about Prize Picks is just you versus the projections. You're not competing against other people. It's safe, it's fast, it's easy. It's currently in operation in over 30 states in the US and Canada. And all you got to do to play is download the app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with the promo code Locked On. That means if you deposit $100, they will give you another $100 to play with. So don't forget that promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. And guys, this episode is also brought to you by BetterHelp Therapy Online. Life doesn't come with a user manual. And so when things aren't working for you, it's normal to feel stuck. and therapists are trained to help people learn productive coping skills for all of life's challenges. And BetterHelp is connected with over 3 million people already with licensed therapists, myself included. It's convenient, it's secure, it's accessible anywhere, 100% online. And one of the coping skills I've learned over the past few months with BetterHelp is understanding that you can only control what you actually can control, and stressing about things that are out of your control isn't going to help me. And I love BetterHelp because it's a much more affordable option than traditional offline therapy. And if you also need it, you can get financial aid availability. And I see it as an affordable way to invest in myself. And if you're looking to make a similar investment, get unstuck with BetterHelp. Learn more and save 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. And guys, let's talk about Ryan Nielsen, the Saints defensive line coach. He's currently the co-defensive coordinator alongside Chris Richard. Presumably he's like the defensive run coordinator, I would imagine. And Chris Richard is the defensive passing game coordinator, as those titles tend to go. But it's really Dennis Allen still calling the plays, the Saints head coach, of course. Now, what's interesting about Nielsen is I don't believe he's been a full-fledged defensive coordinator ever before. He's been a run game coordinator several places at the collegiate level, and now this past year with the Saints. But if he was a full-fledged defensive coordinator calling all the plays, that was, maybe a decade or more ago at like Central Connecticut State or something like that. Now, what's interesting is some of the connections he has. Obviously, Terry Fontenot from his time in New Orleans is well-versed in Ryan Nielsen, since he's been the Saints D-line coach since 2017. But he's also known by Dwayne Ledford, because they say served on the same coaching staff in 2016 at NC State when Ledford was the offensive line coach there. And notably, that NC State defenses in those years had a couple of young future NFL players like Bradley Chubb and BJ Hill and Justin Jones, alongside a couple of other guys that are currently in the NFL like T.Y. McGill. So those are all guys that, Nielsen had a significant hand in developing at the collegiate level. And obviously he's translated that into a lot of success at the NFL level these last 6 years with the Saints and their pass rush on the defensive line. They've been second in the NFL over the last 6 years combined in terms of sacks produced in that period of time. And so when we look at Nielsen, we probably are looking mainly at Dennis Allen's tendencies to sort of try to guess what Nielsen-led Falcons defense would look like. And, the Dennis Allen-led Saints are mostly known for pressuring with just 4. They do blitz occasionally. Demario Davis has been one of the best pass rushing linebackers in the league the last several years, but it's not as if they're bringing 5- and 6-man guys a ton relative to other teams. So they're primarily a team that pressures with 4, and they've been able to do that because of the talent they have up front on the defensive line, in part thanks to Nielsen's development. And they also play a lot of man coverage on the back end, but they're not strictly a cover 1 team. They've been a team that has led the league the last couple of seasons in cover 2-man, cover 5, as some people refer to it, where you have those 2 deep safeties, but you're playing man underneath. So it's 2-man under is another term for it. Notably, they're one of the teams that are consistently at the bottom of the league in terms of playing cover 3 usage, which, is notable because that's been the main coverage that the Falcons have played this year. And most teams up until the last couple of years have primarily been cover 3 majority defense when it comes to zone. So that would be a significant change. Now, I don't know how much of a shift the Saints had in 2022. It seemed like, based off of my initial research, all the data hasn't come out yet about, teams' coverage tendencies this year, but it did seem like they did dial back the man coverage a little bit this year. But part of me wonders, is that due to Marshawn Lattimore missing half of the season, and therefore them not having as much confidence playing that man-heavy scheme with, Adebo and Alontae Taylor and some of the older veteran corners that they had this past year. So, just because those are Dennis Allen tendencies does not necessarily mean that Nielsen is going to be the same. But given that, that's been Nielsen's main NFL experience, or only NFL experience, you would imagine he would probably incorporate a lot of those same tendencies What's other interesting about Nielsen is you rarely see defensive coordinators in the NFL that have D-line backgrounds, right? Most of the defensive coordinators in the NFL are former linebacker coach, former defensive backs coach, especially defensive backs, right? Which, again, goes back to something you've heard me say many times. When you're looking at defensive scheme, it's more about what coverages you run than necessarily what your front is, which is not used to be how we term defenses, because we would categorize them as 3-4 versus 4-3 based off of the fronts. But it's really the coverage schemes that differentiate defenses more in today's NFL, because everybody runs hybrid stuff. Although the Saints are more traditionally a 4-3 defense. But Dan Quinn, of course, is the exception, the relatively rare exception to a defensive coordinator that has a D-line background, and maybe Nielsen will be another name on that list if he were to be the Falcons hire. Another pros and cons of maybe a Nielsen hire would be, one of the pros is, hey, it increases the odds that the Falcons bring some of these ex-Saints defensive linemen, several of which are free agents like Marcus Davenport and David Onyemata, to Atlanta this offseason. Of course, the cons are that lack of experience. So we'll sort of have to see. And if I were to editorialize a little bit like I did earlier with Brian Flores, on that similar note, like, I would, sitting here as an outside observer who has no inside information on this, but between Flores questioning whether Flores would take the job, I probably would have less questions about Nielsen taking the job, just because he's kind of an up and comer, and there may not be too many guaranteed opportunities in the future for him to get a defensive coordinator job. Not to mention the notion of D-line coaches don't often get these opportunities. Like Flores, he's a younger guy. Nielsen's going to turn 44 in March. Flores is going to turn 42 next month. So you like to see that youth that both of these guys potentially bring to the table. And both of these guys bring different styles, Flores and Nielsen, that is, to what the Falcons have run, a lot more man coverage and whatnot. Although I think Flores would be night and day different from what the Falcons did, compared to Nielsen being, at least if he borrows some of those Dennis Allen tendencies, is closer to the middle. If Dean Pease is at one end of the spectrum and Flores is at the other end of the spectrum, Nielsen's probably somewhere in the middle. So, I like the ideal of Nielsen because maybe it means the Falcons, do the thing that the Saints have done and invest significant resources in their D-line, having that deep rotation up front, and, get a good pass rush, right? It's weird how the Saints seem to find a way to, develop a pass rush by investing resources into their pass rush. It's a weird concept, but maybe he can bring that here to Atlanta. But we're talking about two young guys, and Brian Flores and Ryan Nielsen. We'll sort of wrap up today's episode talking about an older candidate in Jerry Gray, as well as one that may not be a candidate anymore because the Denver Broncos blocked him, in Ejiro Evero, which is probably a little bit too reminiscent to a past experience with Falcon fans. And so we might be a little bit triggered. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we wrap up today's episode, guys. But before we get there, I do want to plug Locked On NFL podcast as your second listen. Again, always thanking you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen, but for your second listen, check out Locked On NFL. Of course, Mondays are a great time to check out those shows because they're going to give you the lowdown on all the weekend's action. Of course, that was playoff action. I'm actually recording this during the fourth quarter of the Dolphins-Bills game. The Bills seem to be taking care of business, but it's been kind of a back and forth type of game. So we'll see how that closed out, but get the lowdown on that game as well as the other weekends. Very, very, interesting is probably the most boring way I could describe the playoff games so far, especially the Saturday games. So get that lowdown on Locked On NFL. And now I want to tell you guys about today's sponsor, the mobile game Ultimate Football GM. If you've ever dreamed of being an NFL GM and managing every strategic aspect of your football team, from hiring and firing coaches, coordinators, trading, signing, drafting players, all that and more, this is definitely the game for you. The challenges, guys, are real. The realism is high. I had a couple of people on the Discord talk about some of the challenges. Someone who sort of built their team to be this tough, hard-nosed, physical, defensive-minded football team. His first game, he got blown out 48-3. So frankly, guys, this is not Madden on rookie mode. So if you think you got this covered, go out there and challenge yourself. Prove it to yourself that you could be the ultimate football GM, and you'll get a 100% free boost to your franchise with the promo code Locked On. That's Locked On in all caps at the game store. And all you got to do to answer this challenge, guys, is download the game by visiting ultimate-gm.com or look it up in your preferred app store. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. So we're talking about a couple of candidates that emerged. We already talked about Brian Flores and Ryan Nielsen. Let's talk a little bit about Jerry Gray. And Jerry Gray is older. He's 60 years old. We're not ageist here on Locked On Falcons. But, there is a notable difference. More experience. That's a pro if we're talking about that compared to some of these other guys. And he was a name that we mentioned, I think, last week on one of the episodes when we talked about potential candidates, given his connection and familiarity with Arthur Smith. They overlapped in Tennessee when Arthur Smith was an assistant coach under Mike Munchak, and Jerry Gray was the defensive coordinator of those Mike Munchak-led Titans teams from 2011 to 2013. He spent 5 years prior to that in the early 2000s as a defensive coordinator under Greg Williams, when the latter was the head coach of the Bills from 2001 to 2005. Obviously, he had the 3 years in Tennessee. The past 2 years, he's been the pass game coordinator for the Green Bay Packers under DC Joe Barry. He's notable for replacing Joe Witt Jr. as the Packers DB's coach back in 2020. You guys remember Joe Witt Jr. We sort of gave all the credit for developing a lot of good Packers DBs and seemingly doing a great job sort of establishing things with AJ Terrell in that 2020 season. And obviously Green Bay's secondary has been pretty solid these last couple of years. Prior to joining Green Bay, Jerry Gray was notably the DB's coach for the Minnesota Vikings for 6 years under Mike Zimmer. So a lot of connections with a lot of good defenses, has been part of a lot of good defensive staffs. Now Green Bay's defense, notably the last 2 years, has not been great in DVOA rankings. I think they were 20th and 22nd the last 2 years, but their pass defense wasn't the problem. I want to say that they were 8th this past year against the pass in Football Outsiders DVOA rankings. Now in those Titans years when he was actually the defensive coordinator, I think their defense ranked between like 18 and 25 in all 3 of those years. So basically a below average defense those years. Now the connection with Greg Williams, someone who's overlapped with him in several stints, I think Buffalo, Washington, and even in Tennessee, because they hired Greg Williams in that 3rd year coming off of the Bounty Gate scandal in 2013 as like a senior defensive assistant or something like that. But one of the articles I read was like Jerry Gray's not necessarily known for being as aggressive defensive play caller as Greg Williams is, who, is well known, infamous for being, one of the more blitz happy, defensive coordinators in the NFL over the past, several decades. Now it did seem like they did dial up the blitz a little bit more in that 3rd year when Greg Williams joined that staff. But prior to that, they were kind of league average based off of what I saw. And I read a couple of articles where Jerry Gray was extremely unpopular by the time he left Tennessee. And so they were ready to move on with, I think, Mike Mularkey, if I'm not mistaken, took over after him, after Munchak, when they changed things up. So I think one of the pros of Jerry Gray is the experience and the fact that most of his teams that he's coached for, have had good corners. You go all the way back to Buffalo, they had Nate Clements and Antoine Winfield. You go to Tennessee, where they had Jason McCourty and Alteron Werner. Minnesota, Xavier Rhodes and Terrence Newman. Green Bay these last couple of years with Jair Alexander and Eric Stokes. And so it does seem like, to a certain extent, and this is an oversimplification, but one would imagine if the Falcons were to hire Jerry Gray or even Brian Flores, the odds go up that 8th overall draft selection is a cornerback. And if they were to hire, say, Ryan Nielsen, it seems like that's, likely to be a pass rusher based off of their sort of tendencies and what they seem to look for. So, I think if the pro of Jerry Gray is, if you're in the camp of like, let's get another top flight corner to put opposite AJ Terrell, maybe he's not quite Brian Flores on that level in terms of what people want to see. But, he could be sort of that notch below in terms of, getting there. We'll talk a little bit about why, you should be more focused on the personnel than necessarily the guys calling the plays. But we'll wrap up today's episode talking about someone who presumably will not be a defensive coordinator candidate here, and that's Ejiro Evero with the Denver Broncos blocking the Falcons' request to interview him. Evero, if you're not familiar with, another young guy, 42 years old, his first time DC in Denver this past year, and had one of the top defenses in the NFL. And the thing about Evero that stands out is that he has been an assistant coach on a lot of staffs that had some of the top defensive minds at the time. Vic Fangio, Wade Phillips, Brandon Staley. And so, he's a hot name in terms of head coaching interview candidates, right? He's already interviewed, I believe, for the Denver job, as an internal candidate for them. Indianapolis, I believe he's already interviewed. I think he has an interview lined up for both the vacancies in Carolina and Houston as well. So, that leads us to why the Broncos were successfully able to block the Falcons' request, because they can't really stop him from getting a promotion, which would be going from a defensive coordinator to a head coach, but they can stop him from making lateral moves from going to a defensive coordinator of the Broncos to a defensive coordinator of another team, right? And the reason why they would do that, even if they don't have a head coach right now, they don't know who their defensive coordinator is because if they do wind up hiring the new head coach, sooner versus later, they're maybe open to the idea of having some continuity on that side of the ball to continue, having a top 5, top 10 type of defense. And the new head coach will sort of bring him on as that job. And it's very similar, and that's why I mentioned being triggered earlier, to the situation involving the Broncos blocking Gary Kubiak from being interviewed by the Falcons way back in 2019 when the Falcons were looking for a new offensive coordinator to replace Steve Sarkisian. And that January, the Broncos had just fired Vance Joseph, right? They were looking for a new head coach, but they wanted Gary Kubiak to kind of stick around potentially as the offensive coordinator under that new head coach. And so they blocked it when the Falcons wanted to bring Kubiak to Atlanta. And, hindsight and rumors and reports tell us that Kubiak presumably was the first choice to replace Sark. But once they blocked it in the timeline, had to go back and look at the timeline where it was like one day they got blocked by the Broncos, and then I think like 2 days later the Falcons wound up hiring Dirk Cutter, and then like the day after that the Broncos made it official to hire Vic Fangio as their head coach. And then then after a week of that, and Fangio deciding to go in a different direction as far as offensive coordinator goes from Gary Kubiak, then Gary Kubiak winds up going and joining the Minnesota Vikings. And that series of events, had major impacts for several football teams. Obviously, the Falcons settling for Cutter, the Broncos with their offensive struggles in those Fangio years, Minnesota Vikings, where Kubiak went to, boosting Kevin Stefanski's stock, which led to him getting the job in Cleveland the next year. You can even argue that it's impacting, Will Levis, right? The offensive coordinator that Fangio picked, Rich Scangarello, wound up getting fired after 1 year and replaced by Pat Shurmur. And Scangarello, it was the offensive coordinator in Kentucky this past year, which kind of hurt Will Levis's stock. And so, does that impact, say, a team like Houston or Indianapolis or whoever team winds up picking Will Levis, and maybe he falls further in the draft than he could have, or whatever, who knows at this point in time. So, there's a lot of ripple effects from that decision for the Falcons getting a little impatient in settling on Dirk Cutter. Maybe they could be a little bit patient. Obviously this coaching staff doesn't have didn't go through that experience, but maybe there is a lesson to learn, and maybe be a little bit patient in this situation, and maybe wait the Broncos out. I'm sorry, right? I think this weekend has been clearly about setting up interviews that they probably will conduct over the course of this upcoming week. And we are 2 weeks away from the Falcons traveling to Las Vegas to be one of the coaches in the Shrine Bowl, the East-West Shrine Bowl, alongside the New England Patriots. And we've already speculated here on Locked On Falcons that it would make sense if the Falcons were hoping to have their defensive coordinator hire in place before they got there. So that would leave about a 2-week window. So we'll see, how their timeline is. But it'll be interesting with the Broncos, because what's complicating that obviously is they're hiring a head coach. And, the betting favorite right now is, of course, our good buddy Dan Quinn to be the Broncos' next head coach. Of course, Sean Payton, Jim Harbaugh, I'm sorry, also have very favorable odds. And so we'll see what that goes like. And obviously, the Broncos can't officially hire Dan Quinn until after his team is eliminated from the playoffs, the Dallas Cowboys. They're playing on, I believe, Monday night, tonight, as many of you are watching or listening this episode. So I guess if you're, pining for Ejiro Evero, you're kind of rooting for Tom Brady and the Bucks tonight, I guess. I don't know. You guys tell me. So we'll see how that goes. But, I'm curious to see who you guys of these candidates, who you guys are most interested in. I'm imagining, most of you will probably say Flores or Evero. I'm curious how many Nielsen and Jerry Gray stands are out there. If you're asking me who I, prefer when it comes to these hires, like, I certainly have a preference, but my strong preference is, who's going to be the guy that, gets us, who I don't really care who's calling plays as long as it gets us, Jesse Bates and Matt Ioannidis and Dalvin Tomlinson and Deron Payne and Marcus Davenport and Anya Mata and Levante David and Jamel Dean. Like, whoever can get us to sign those guys, that's the guy who I would like to see this team hire. And I've used this analogy before. It's like ice cream preferences. Like, who's your preference, right? Chocolate or vanilla. And like, I have a preference. Don't get me wrong. If you offered me chocolate or vanilla, I will choose one. But if you told me, oh, I'm sorry, we ran out of that flavor, then I'm not going to sit here and turn down the other flavor. So that's kind of where I'm at with these defensive coordinators. Like, you look at Brian Flores, it's like, yeah, man, he had a top 5 secondary. They had the most expensive secondary in the NFL in 2020 and 2021. I think that probably had a lot more to do with his success, especially when you compare it to what they had in that secondary in 2019, than necessarily some magic scheme that he incorporated. And just like, why are the Saints been so successful the last 6 years? Oh, probably has a lot to do with the fact that they've been averaging, 47 sacks a year over the last 6 seasons. And you compare that to the 29 sacks that the Falcons have been averaging in that same period of time. It's like, it probably has a lot more to do with their success. And so those are the things that I'm really invested in, rather than, who's calling plays in that regard. So they're not the only candidates. We got at least another one that came out Sunday on Al Holcomb, who's, I don't know his official title with the Carolina Panthers, but I think he got promoted to the defensive coordinator spot, for Steve Wilkes's interim staff, if I'm not mistaken, in the back half of the season. I'll do a little bit more research. That's why we're not talking about him, because basically that news broke, only an hour or so before I decided to jump on to record this podcast, and hadn't done enough research to really break him down. But that will probably be somebody that we talk about later this week. We'll probably try to have some guests on later this week as well to give their thoughts on the Falcons DC search and their season and off-season moves as well. And probably by the end of this week, we'll probably get into some of those positional year-end reviews, probably starting with the quarterback position as well. So those are all the things on deck, guys, this week on Locked On Falcons. Thank you for making us your first listen. For your second listen, check out Locked On NFL, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Braves, Peacock and Williamson, all that and more, guys, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.